Hello, and
Hello.
welcome to Bethany Ames, an EQ alumni and a qualified English teacher now. And you trained with us last year, and you're now coming to the end of your ECT year. So the reason I wanted to catch up with you is, quite apart from finding out how this first year's been for you, I also wanted to talk to you about your recent article in the spring edition of the English Association publication entitled Newsletter. But your article in there is really important for us, because at EQ we place a lot of emphasis on developing subject knowledge and also encouraging trainees to join and stay quite close to their subject associations. So, and you really have been actively participating in the subject community. And your article is sort of right there amongst articles from Matthew Carnaby at Inspiration Trust, Joe Barber at the Met, and Sean McAvoy, who's a fellow. So yours was entitled Creating Exceptional Curricula. But I'm particularly interested in a paragraph that came close to the end of your article, which says, I'm going to read it to you, so that was always excruciating. Although my training year was an abnormal, turbulent whirlwind, it also provided the benefit of not knowing what non-COVID teaching is. For us, education has been defined by a pandemic from the opening credits. We've no point of comparison, and with this ignorance comes a fresh perspective. The adaptability required by distance learning is testament to the resourcefulness and creativity of teaching staff across the country. But in many ways, it's made teaching and learning process far more transparent for trainees. Now, I mean, you really are glass half full because you had a lot of disruptions to your training year because of COVID. So this perspective that you talk about there, how do you think that's seen you through your first year? That you talked about knowing more, other colleagues being transparent. How's that helped you in your first year as an ECT?
Yeah, I think it's made me far more thoughtful about diagnosing what students do and don't know. I think particularly with kind of that gap in learning, I've kind of gone in trying to be really kind of diagnostic and just looking at the real granular, sort of at a granular level. What do you know? What don't you know? Like kind of even just literacy level kind of base. Whereas I think if I didn't have that context, perhaps those kind of misconceptions would have been lost within me trying to just kind of navigate a classroom in my ECT year. But I think I went in and it was kind of a whole school effort, is that we need to address this lost learning time. We need to address these gaps in knowledge. So it made that kind of every lesson I was going into, I was having to think really, I guess, in detail, what do I need the children to know? What should they know at this point anyway? And what are they probably going to know, given that they've had, two very disrupted years? So I think it kind of made me break down the kind of learning, the knowledge that I wanted them to acquire over the course of a lesson and over a half term. And I guess be far more rigorous in the way in which I planned for addressing those gaps and those potential misconceptions that they would have.
That's really interesting. So almost the backdrop of a knowledge gap has meant you've reflected, every class, every lesson, every day, in order to see that gap closes. So that's really interesting. So you called your article Creating Exceptional Curricula. And so creating it, so does that mean that you are not just an ECT? What is it that you're doing? And how has your career progressed since we left you as a trainee?
Okay, so yes, I am involved in creating. I took over the post of Key Stage 4 Curriculum Coordinator. So I have been very heavily involved in developing sort of Key Stage 4 curriculum and upgrading what we currently had in place, with and alongside some Key Stage 3 as well. So yeah, I think the creating exceptional curricula is sort of something that I've kind of heard throughout my school building and across departments these last couple of years, but definitely this last year. Again, thinking about sort of post-COVID and how we are developing the students' knowledge and also giving exceptional teaching and offering an exceptional curriculum in general. So that's something that I think as a whole school has been a massive focus for this year. We've been working quite diligently on schemes of work and ensuring that they are bespoke to not only the department, but to the teachers, to the class as well, and trying to like reduce variability across classrooms, reduce variability of teaching, of learning, ensuring that all students are getting an exceptional education, essentially. So obviously I have been quite heavily involved in making that happen within my department, and specifically within that key stage. So I think when I was thought about creating exceptional curricula, it's obviously kind of coming from a place of, what do we currently teach? Do we need to teach those texts? Could we teach them any better? We've stuck with the text that we know for the moment. With Key Stage 3, we're making a few tweaks kind of this year and going into next. But I think my kind of role came down on, how are we teaching it and could we make it better? So I've kind of put a big push this year on like developing literacy teaching in year 10, teaching keywords, ensuring that students are using tier 2 vocabulary, because obviously they had a very disrupted year 8 and year 9 when literacy is the main sort of focus. So that's kind of been in my mind going into this year, and how I can try and I guess bridge the gap that they would have from their year 8 and year 9 key stage 3 learning going into what is now GCSE content. So trying to kind of I guess preempt the things that they should know that they won't, and ensuring that that's kind of embedded within what is also a challenging key stage 4 curriculum.
That's really interesting, because of course as a trainee you go from teaching lessons to sequences.
Yeah.
Here you speak now, you're right there developing curriculum over time, knowledge over time, building an architecture that means that pupils can actually succeed and fill the gaps that you are anticipating that they had. So trainee, Key Stage 4 coordinator, structuring curricula next year.
So next year, I am actually taking over the role as acting head of department. My current head of department is going off for maternity leave, so I'm going to be stepping into her shoes for a year, which is going to be a challenge, but I'm excited about it. So obviously this year has been a great experience for me to kind of learn and think more kind of holistically about how we approach the curriculum across the departments, across the classrooms, across teachers. And I've kind of had a sort of, knowing obviously that she's going with some warning, we have had sort of an extended sort of handover period. So I have been shadowing her for the past half term, which has been obviously a great sort of insight, and will definitely make my plunge into the deep end much more seamless, I hope, and a bit easier in September. So yeah, obviously what I've been doing this year will then take a step up next year, thinking not only about curriculum development, but also management of staff, etc. So it's an exciting leap.
And do you, because you talked that last year curricula was a focus, departmental focus. So under your stewardship, does the department have a particular focus next year that you know that you're going to have to lead colleagues on? Is there something else that you want to kind of focus on?
Yeah, so that what I was talking about, the keywords, etc., developing literacy in key stage 10, year 10, key stage 4. I'm planning to bring down now to key stage 3, far more sort of embedded and systematically. So every lesson will have tier 2 vocabulary explicitly taught at the start, then reviewed, retrieved. Retrieval practice is something that my current head of department has worked a lot on in the last couple of years. So that's firmly embedded now across all units, all lessons. So maintaining that, but then also giving it a vocabulary and literacy focus as well, I think will be quite useful. And then we also want to try and upgrade and develop our speaking and listening offer. At the moment, it's not necessarily a huge priority of ours at Key Stage 3. We kind of do it implicitly, but I think we need more explicit sort of teaching of that to prepare them obviously for what they have to do in year 10 with their, year 10 and 11 with their speaking and listening component for their GCSE, but obviously also just developing their oracy.
Focused oracy, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you've really got some kind of quite large projects that you need to embed, all the way through. That's exciting for you.
Yeah.
And great, because it's such a fantastic experience, isn't it? So when you talk about your curricula in the article, you talked about the you have an I do, we do, you do structure as a collective. Now clearly that's going to ring bells with a lot of our trainees, because it's deeply based on Rosenshine. So at EQ we have an evidence base that underpins all the training that we offer to trainees. So this is Rosenshine, but is it Rosenshine as we know it, or does your curricula and the fact that premise of I do, you do, we do you move it on some more when you're all doing it as a whole collective?
I'd say it's very much based on Rosenshine. It's kind of stemmed from his principles, definitely. The I do section obviously being predominantly modelling and teaching of new material. The we do is typically questioning, assessing for learning, class discussion, and then the I do is the independent practice. I think that the I do is something that we've really had to kind of hone in on, because I think as a whole we often, it's very teacher led. The students we've reflected, and the students haven't been doing as much as they need to, and obviously lockdown, and I mentioned this in the article as well, that lockdown I think exposed that some students, not that they weren't pulling their weight, but some students I think just they haven't got the study habits, particularly the younger years. So I think the I do section was something we really had to think about. Sorry, the you do section is what we had to think about, because actually those students, you want them to feel like they can accomplish the task, and within one lesson it's often quite difficult, I think, to go from an I do section to a you do section seamlessly within the space of 50 minutes, where the students actually do feel ready to do the task, particularly in English, where it's quite it's a very skills-based subject. Of course you are acquiring knowledge all the time, but the skills are something that is mastered over time. So that's something we've had to think quite carefully about, and we're still perfecting. So yeah, I think, as I say, it's definitely kind of rooted in Rosenshine's principles, but we're still kind of working out the tricky bits now about how that actually works in practice in a classroom, particularly in an English classroom, within the space of 50 minutes to do those steps.
You're quite right. The transition to I do is, you know, as a student, as a pupil, you've got to be very secure on the craft of the writing and what you're being asked to do. So, I mean, would you say to current trainees that that it's important to remain close to your subject? You know, I mean, you get subject knowledge when you're working with your specialist tutor through training, because they're subject specialists and working with you. But beyond, when your training ends, obviously you're working with the English Association, but are there any other things that you're doing that's keeping your subject knowledge sharp as you take on all these other posts within the subject?
Yeah, so I think absolutely you need to stay close to your subject knowledge, both of pedagogy and also your actual subject, the curriculum. Obviously, kind of me looking ahead now to becoming the acting head of department, I've done a lot of reading in the last sort of couple of months, trying to really get my head around what texts I want to change in Key Stage 3, why I might want to change them. Twitter has been a fabulous resource for that as well. And I think just kind of picking up on those conversations and those dialogues that are going on between, you know, experts and very experienced teachers has been invaluable, and it's kind of pointed me in very different directions as to, you know, what I might want to go off and read and explore for next year. Obviously as well, then thinking on a kind of a pedagogy level and kind of beyond into leadership. I've definitely kind of delved into lots of different reading in the last couple of weeks, and the plan to over summer as well. But I think that definitely has informed my practice, and with Key Stage 4 as well this year. I think had I not sort of constantly, I guess, reflected and responded to those reflections, and also then those reflections prompt me to go off and seek advice elsewhere, whether that be through colleagues at work, on Twitter, or by reading. I don't think I would feel as confident now moving into my current position had I not done that.
Yeah, and the subject knowledge changes, doesn't it? And it's very organic, and lots of people have different influences on it. And you're right, to, you know, staying close to it is really important. So next year, the trainees will have a professional in residence. So working alongside the English cohort will be a writer in residence. So if you'd have had that writer when you were training, what would you have been saying to me as curriculum lead? What would you have been saying we need to get that writer to do? What would you have wanted an actual published novelist, and she's also a journalist? How would you have wanted to have used that particular resource?
That's an interesting question. I think I would have wanted them to break down their process for writing, particularly I think the novelist, or a writer of fiction. Obviously that is something that I think is quite tricky to teach. It's a very sort of nuanced unit of study, I think, and it's very difficult to kind of transfer to students in what is both an achievable but also creative and individual way. Yeah. So I would love to have some insights into a writer's process, and how they go about sort of coming up with ideas and developing them into full stories, because obviously it's no easy feat.
You're right. Creative writing is traditionally a very difficult area for departments to approach, because we're quite often text-led. And that was one of the reasons I wanted a fiction writer, who predominantly, just because I think all of it, for all of those points that you mentioned. Hopefully it's going to be a great addition, and you can come to anything that we do. You can listen in.
Yeah, interesting.
And so you have now kind of completed your first year as an ECT. How has that felt in terms of because obviously trainees are coming to the end right now for us, so, and then they're ready to start in this process. Have you enjoyed continued mentoring and continued kind of consideration about the core content framework and various different aspects of pedagogy? Have you enjoyed that extended interaction with that?
Yeah, definitely. I think I've really appreciated having the mentor meetings once a week, and the observations. I think it's been invaluable, essentially, kind of having somebody sit in on my lessons and give me feedback, maintained throughout this year. So I've really appreciated it. I think as well it was good too, because I had a different mentor this year to last year, so I've had the benefit of two very different eyes watching me, and then also I've had some kind of guest observers as well within that. So I think it's the best way of learning really about your practice and what you're doing in the classroom, having that fresh set of eyes to look at the class as well as you, and give you feedback in order to improve.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for giving up your time at the end of a really long teaching day, and a long hot teaching day, and just moments before you're ready to start your summer holiday. But it was so lovely to catch up with you, and particularly well done on having a published article and being able to kind of begin that journey into research in the subject. I'm really grateful. So Bethany, thank you so much.
Thank you.